30 years, 7 movies, 1 mask that refuses to stay in the closet. Scream 7 just broke the franchise's own box office record, pulling in close to $100 million worldwide on opening weekend alone, more than any Ghostface movie before it. It did that while critics handed it the worst reviews the series has ever gotten, a 33% on Rotten Tomatoes, the lowest score of all 7 films. So people are already arguing about whether the movie itself is any good. I want to ask a different question. Out of every single person who has ever picked up that phone, put on that costume, and gone full Ghostface, who actually deserves to be remembered as dangerous, not the most quotable, not the most memeable, actually genuinely dangerous. That's what we're doing today. Every Ghostface killer from all 7 films, all 17 of them, rank from the ones who couldn't scare a golden retriever to the one who basically wrote the rulebook every slasher villain since has been copying from. I'm splitting this into 3 parts because there's simply too much ground to cover properly in one sitting, and honestly, these characters deserve better than a rush take. If you want to argue with my order, and you will, drop your own top 3 in the comments once you've seen where everyone lands. I read every single one of them. Quick word on how I'm scoring this, because it's not just body count. Some of the deadliest names on this list barely swing a knife themselves. I'm weighing 4 things for each killer. How much of an actual physical and psychological threat they pose to the people around them. Whether their motive still makes sense once you sit with it for more than 5 seconds. How well the movie actually pulls off their reveal. And how much of a mark they've left on the franchise and on horror as a whole, 30 years on. Stack those 4 things together and you get where somebody lands. Some killers are terrifying in the moment, but forgettable a year later. Some barely lift a finger, but completely rewrite how you think about everyone else in the movie. Both count. One more thing before we start climbing the list. This franchise has always been self-aware about exactly this kind of ranking exercise. The original Scream spends a big chunk of its runtime having its own characters lecture each other about the unofficial rules of surviving a horror movie, the kind of checklist about who typically lives and who typically doesn't. So it feels right to hold these killers to the same standard the movies hold themselves to. A good Ghostface isn't just someone who racks up a kill count. It's someone whose reveal makes you want to rewatch the entire film with new eyes. Keep that in mind as we go, because a couple of these rankings are going to surprise you. Let's get into it. We're starting at the very bottom with a guy who doesn't even get the dignity of a proper introduction. Gregg Bruckner opened Scream 6 as one half of a fake-out killer duo, and by the time we actually meet him, he's already dead, folded into a fridge like leftover takeout. Gregg never gets to swing a knife on screen. He never gets a line of dialogue while wearing the mask. His entire resume as a killer is getting murdered by the real Ghostface before his own plan gets past the planning stage. Now, to be fair to the writers, that's kind of the point of the character. Gregg exists to make you assume Scream 6 is going back to the 2-killer formula from the original film, and then the movie yanks that assumption away in the first 10 minutes. As a structural trick, it works. As a villain, there's nothing here. Gregg is a plot device wearing a costume, and he never gets the chance to be anything more. There's actually an ongoing debate among fans over whether Gregg should even count as a real Ghostface at all, since he's never conscious for a single second of screen time and never makes a choice we get to witness. I'm including him because he wears the mask and the credits list him as one, but I get why some ranking videos leave him off entirely. When your biggest claim to fame in a slasher franchise is being cold storage, dead last is generous. Honestly, it's not close. Point one spot up is Jason Carver, the other half of that same opening duo, played by an actor you will absolutely recognize if you spent any time in the Spider-Man movies. Jason actually gets to do something Gregg never does. He kills his film professor, Laura Crane, played by Samara Weaving, in a brutal, genuinely well-shot opening sequence that had a lot of people convinced Scream 6 was handing us the killer reveal in the very first act. That would have been a massive swing for a franchise built entirely around delayed reveals. Then the movie pulls the rug out. Jason gets outsmarted and killed by Detective Bailey's real Ghostface crew before his own plan gets anywhere close to finished. His whole philosophy is built around finishing what he sees as unfinished business from the last film, dressed up in film school language about elevated horror, which is a little rich for a guy who doesn't survive past the 15-minute mark. Credit where it's due, that opening kill is one of the better ones in the modern era of this franchise. There's a pattern worth noticing here too. This franchise has been killing off its opening scene Ghostface since the very first movie, when Drew Barrymore's boyfriend gets strung up as an opening gut punch before the title card even hits. Jason is part of that lineage, the disposable cold open scare that exists to remind you nobody is safe, not even the person the trailer made you think was the lead. It's a good trick when it works. It just means the person wearing the mask rarely gets to be more than a jump scare with a backstory. Surviving long enough to actually matter is kind of the bare minimum for a slasher villain, and Jason doesn't clear it. Now we jump to the newest film. Karl Gibbs, full name Karl Allen Gibbs, played by Craig Drake, is one of 3 Ghostface working the case in Scream 7, and he draws the short straw of the trio. Before the movie even starts, Karl has already killed 3 people as an escaped patient from a local psychiatric facility, so on paper, he should be terrifying. In practice, he spends most of his screen time lurking around Sydney's coffee shop, giving off exactly the kind of stare that tells you he's important before the movie has told you anything else about him. When he finally gets his moment, breaking into Sydney's house and fighting her husband Mark, and her daughter Tatum, he actually holds his own for a minute, which is more than a lot of names further down this list can say. Then Gail runs him over with an SUV, and that's Karl done, in the middle of the second act, with almost no backstory beyond escape patient with an unhealthy obsession with the in-universe stab movies. It later comes out that Karl was mostly a pawn for the real masterminds. What's interesting about Karl is how much he breaks from tradition. Every prior Ghostface, going all the way back to Billy and Stu, is defined by talking. This franchise built its entire identity on a killer who calls you on the phone and makes you play a trivia game before he shows up. Karl doesn't get a single word of dialogue behind a mask. He's closer to a silent, unstoppable Michael Myers type than a classic motor-mouthed Ghostface. And while that's a legitimate choice for one killer out of a trio, it also means he's the least distinctly Scream character on this entire list. Decent physical threat. Almost no character underneath the mask. Marco Davis is where Scream 7 gets genuinely interesting, and also where it gets a little messy. Marco, played by Ethan Landry, works as a supervisor at the same psychiatric facility Karl escapes from, and he's got a background in information technology, reportedly from time spent at a major tech company before switching careers entirely. That detail matters more than it sounds like it should, because Marco is the one who builds the deepfake technology that lets the killers fake video calls from Stu Macker, Nancy Loomis, and Roman Bridger, resurrecting the franchise's greatest villains just to psychologically torture Sydney before anyone even puts on a mask. That is genuinely one of the smarter ideas this franchise has had in years, using real-world anxiety about artificial intelligence as the engine for a legacy sequel 30 years after the original. Ethan Embry has been a working genre actor for decades, and there's something almost meta about casting someone with that much horror history to play the guy who literally builds a synthetic ghost of the franchise's most beloved dead killer. The problem is Marco himself as a character. His personal reason for going along with an actual murder plot is never really spelled out beyond simply knowing Jessica from the hospital. We never learn why an IT supervisor with a stable job decides that mass murder is a reasonable weekend project. He's the architect of the movie's cleverest twist and one of its thinnest characters, sitting in the exact same body. Great toolkit, almost no resume beyond it. Jessica Bowden is technically the mastermind of Scream 7, which tells you a lot about how this particular film handles its villains. Jessica, played by Anna Camp, is Sydney's next-door neighbor, someone who says she survived an abusive marriage after reading Sydney's memoir about surviving her own Ghostface attacks, and who ends up killing her husband using that book as her inspiration. That is a genuinely dark, genuinely compelling backstory on paper. Then the movie asks us to believe that instead of simply living her life afterward, Jessica becomes so consumed by Sydney that she recruits an escaped patient and a hospital IT supervisor to stage an elaborate, deepfake heavy murder plot. Also, she can turn Sydney's own daughter into a brand new final girl. It's a big swing. It doesn't fully land, and the critics agreed with that assessment, since this film walked away with the lowest Rotten Tomatoes score in the franchise's history. And a lot of that criticism circled right back to Jessica's motivation feeling more like a thesis statement than an actual person making actual choices. Funny enough, going into release, Anna Camp herself basically called the twist coming in an interview, saying she took the online guessing as a compliment because the role needed someone who could carry the entire back half of the film. She wasn't wrong about carrying it. The performance is committed. It's the script around her that keeps undercutting the work. In a fight, she's relentless and genuinely hard to put down. As a criminal mastermind, the math never quite adds up, and that gap between box office and reception is honestly the whole story of this movie in miniature. Audiences showed up in record numbers. The writing didn't always earn it. Ethan Landry closes out our bottom stretch. And honestly, he might be the most frustrating name on this entire list, not because the character is bad, but because there's clearly a better version of him sitting just out of reach. Ethan is Detective Wayne Bailey's son, one of 3 Ghostface working together in Scream 6. And for most of the runtime, he's the quiet one, the guy busy establishing an alibi while his father and sister handle the heavy lifting. When the mask finally comes off, he's got 2 confirmed kills to his name, and he holds his own during that apartment ladder sequence between 2 buildings, which remains one of the most purely stressful set pieces this franchise has ever put on screen. But here's the issue nobody quite explains. Ethan saves one of the core group during a subway attack that his own sister is the one carrying out. Is that guilt? Loyalty splitting down the middle? A crack in the family's plan? The movie never tells you. And that gap makes Ethan feel less like a fully formed character and more like a plot requirement that showed up because the story needed a 3rd killer in the family. Between Karl, Marco, Gregg, Jason, and Ethan, that's 5 Ghostface so far who all share the same core problem: thin motivation propping up decent execution. His sister lands in a very different spot when we get to part 2. So keep that comparison in your back pocket. Here's something a lot of casual fans don't know. Every single Ghostface voice in every single one of these 7 films, no matter who's under the mask, is performed by the same man, Roger L. Jackson. He's never shown on camera, and for most of the films, he actually recorded his lines live, feeding dialogue to the actors over an earpiece or an actual phone during filming, rather than the actors just imagining a voice and having it dubbed in later. That's part of why those early phone call scenes feel so unnervingly real. The actor on screen is genuinely reacting to a voice in real time. So no matter how weak or strong a killer ranks on this list, they all got the exact same terrifying voice actor doing the heavy lifting on the phone. Keep that in mind as we go, because it means every single reveal in this franchise has to work twice, once as a voice and once as a face. It also connects to something bigger the franchise has always been chewing on. The original Scream was partly a response to a very 90s fear, the idea that violent movies were turning kids into killers. 30 years later, Scream 7 swaps that anxiety for a very current one. The fear that artificial intelligence can fabricate a dead man's voice and face well enough to fool the people who loved him. Same franchise, same obsession with how media shapes violence, just updated for whatever decade it happens to be released in. That's honestly the smartest through line in the newest movie. Even if the killers wielding it don't always live up to the idea. Quinn Bailey is Ethan's sister, and she pulls off something her brother never quite manages: a fake-out death that actually works. Early in Scream 6, Quinn appears to get stabbed right before the group makes their escape, and it's staged well enough that you genuinely believe she's out of the movie. She isn't. She's hiding in plain sight for most of the back half of the film. And when the 3rd mask comes off, it's her underneath it. That's a real accomplishment in a franchise built entirely on audiences trying to guess who's under the hood. Quinn also gets one of the more brutal individual set pieces in the entire modern era, a subway attack that plays out in a packed train car with nowhere for anyone to run. She commits to that scene completely, and it's genuinely one of the tensest sequences the newer films have produced. The issue is that she's sharing the spotlight with 2 other family members, and when you split a reveal 3 ways, none of the 3 get the full weight they'd have on their own. Compare that to something like the original film, where 2 killers get an entire kitchen sequence to themselves to unravel in front of Sydney. Quinn never gets that kind of room to breathe. Once her cover is blown, she's mostly just one part of a crowded finale rather than a standalone threat. Quinn is proof that a good performer can make the most of limited space. She's just working with limited space, the same issue that held her brother Ethan back a couple spots below her on this list. Family plans sound great on paper. On screen, they tend to dilute the very people carrying them out. Wayne Bailey, played by Dermot Mulroney, should honestly be terrifying on paper. He's a police detective, which means he has access to evidence, inside knowledge of the investigation, and the ability to steer suspicion away from his own family in real time. He's also got two of his own children working the mask alongside him, giving him manpower most Ghostface never get to have. Add a willingness to pull an actual firearm before the mask even comes off, and you've got the ingredients for the most dangerous killer in franchise history. Instead, Wayne becomes the textbook example of a good setup with a shaky follow-through. His motive is straightforward, revenge for his son Richie, but the movie leans so hard into his authority and his access that it never quite explains why someone with that much institutional power still gets outmaneuvered by a group of 20-somethings with kitchen knives. There's a genuinely tense sequence where he corners Sam near a stairwell railing while pointing a loaded gun at her. And for a moment, it actually feels like the franchise is about to do something it's never done before, let a killer when using a firearm instead of a blade. Then the moment passes, and Wayne goes right back to fighting on the franchise's usual terms. He has every advantage on this entire list, and still finds a way to lose. That's not nothing. Plenty of killers here never had a fraction of his resources, but resources you fail to use properly don't count for as much as they should. Authority without restraint just becomes one more loud voice in a room full of people who've already survived worse. Charlie Walker, played by Rory Culkin, is the one I think gets underrated the most by casual fans and overrated slightly by film nerds trying to be contrarian. So let's find the middle ground. Charlie is the modern equivalent of Randy Meeks, the horror-obsessed film kid who actually understands the rules of the genre he's living inside. That knowledge makes him dangerous in a way that's different from pure physical menace. He commits nearly every kill in Scream for himself, including one of the more genuinely disturbing death scenes the franchise has ever put on screen. His weakness is his motive, and this is where I'll push back a little on the common take. A lot of people call Charlie pathetic for being manipulated by Jill Roberts through nothing more than the promise of her affection. I don't think that makes him pathetic. I think it makes him believable, which is honestly rarer in this franchise than you'd expect. Not every killer needs an elaborate ideology. Sometimes a smart kid does something monstrous because somebody he's obsessed with asked him to, and that's a very human, very ugly kind of dangerous. Rory Culkin has built a real reputation in independent horror since this role, and you can see why casting directors kept coming back to him. There's a specific callback in his reveal where the movie recreates a scene from the original film almost beat for beat, the classic tied to a chair, false sense of safety routine, and then flips it into something genuinely upsetting. It's one of the better needle drops of dread in the entire modern trilogy. He's the muscle, not the brains, and that caps how high he can climb. But as far as muscle goes, he's some of the most effective on this list. Amber Freeman, played by Mikey Madison, who's since gone on to win an actual Academy Award, earns her spot here almost entirely on one decision the script makes, letting her kill Dewey Riley. Dewey is one of the 3 original legacy characters who survived the entire original trilogy and both of Wes Craven's later entries. Killing him is the single most shocking death in the franchise since the original film's opening, and Amber is the one holding the knife when it happens. Beyond that one moment, her motive is thinner than it should be, rooted in toxic fandom and heavily borrowed from Richie's obsession rather than something fully her own. But there's a raw, unpredictable energy to her performance once the mask comes off that makes her genuinely fun to watch unravel. She's fearless enough to go after 2 franchise veterans who've survived multiple killers each, and she very nearly wins. There's a great final stretch where she keeps getting back up after taking damage that should have ended the fight twice over, taunting the 2 women trying to stop her the entire time. It's worth pointing out just how far Mikey Madison's career has gone since this role. A few years after playing a Ghostface killer, she picked up the Academy Award for Best Actress for a completely different film, which is a genuinely wild career trajectory for anyone who started out getting set on fire in a suburban kitchen. Ruthless, a little underwritten, but absolutely willing to swing at the biggest targets in the room. That counts for a lot on a list about actual danger. Since we just talked about the two original survivors most at risk in this franchise, here's a fact worth knowing. Sidney Prescott herself, Neve Campbell, actually sat out an entire installment. She wasn't in Scream 6 at all, reportedly stepping away over a pay dispute with the studio, meaning the sixth film had to build its entire back half around Sam, Tara, and the Bailey family without the franchise's original final girl anywhere in the building. Campbell came back for Scream 7 once the studio met her terms, which is part of why that film leans so heavily on Sidney's own house, her own neighbor, and her own daughter as the central threat. The mask has had 17 different faces. The woman surviving it has had exactly one, and even she almost walked away for good. Before we get to the top 7, it's worth pointing out something Wes Craven himself said about what makes a Ghostface actually work. On the commentary track for the original film, Craven made the point that the scariest killers are the killers that are really smart. Not the biggest, not the strongest, the smartest. That's basically the thesis of the entire franchise, and it's exactly why our next few entries start climbing fast. Everyone left on this list either outsmarts the people around them or gets close enough to matter. Keep that idea in your head, because it's about to become very relevant. Here's a fun piece of behind-the-scenes history that most fans don't know. Mickey Altieri almost didn't exist. The original plan for Scream 2's killers was completely different. Sidney's own roommate and boyfriend were set to be revealed as 2 of 4 separate killers, alongside Cotton Weary and Billy Loomis's mother. That script leaked online months before release, and Kevin Williamson had to scrap the whole plan and rewrite the ending from scratch under enormous time pressure. What we actually got, Mrs. Loomis and a film student named Mickey, was the emergency backup plan, and it turned out to be far scarier than the original idea. Mickey, played by Timothy Olyphant, is one of the most theatrical killers in the entire franchise, and his motive is genuinely unique. He wants to be caught. He wants a televised trial where he can blame violent movies for his own actions and become a celebrity in the process. Remember, this movie came out in the exact cultural window, right after a certain nationally televised murder trial dominated American television for the better part of a year. Mickey's entire plan is a dark joke about turning infamy into a defense strategy, and it lands harder than it has any right to. Olyphant plays the monologue at the end of the film like he's been rehearsing it in his head for years. And honestly, in universe, he probably has. It's one of the most quoted, most parroted villain speeches this franchise has ever produced, delivered with a manic energy that makes you believe he really would rather go to prison famous than walk free unknown. His problem is loyalty. He trusts Mrs. Loomis completely, right up until she's the one who puts a bullet in him to keep her own story straight. Brilliant plan, terrible choice of partner, and coming up next, you'll see exactly why trusting her was such a mistake in the first place. Roman Bridger is the only Ghostface in the entire franchise to operate completely alone. No partner, no accomplice, every single kill his own. That alone puts him in rare company. He builds a bulletproof vest into his costume, engineers an advanced voice changer, and stages the most theatrically elaborate reveal of any killer on this list, complete with a projector and pre-recorded audio. This is a man who planned his own unmasking scene the way a director blocks a shot, because that's literally his job. He's Sidney's own half-brother, and the reveal recontextualizes trauma from the very first film. The fight between the two of them is also, technique for technique, one of the best physical confrontations in the entire series, a prolonged, genuinely brutal struggle that finally gives Sidney an opponent who can match her survival instincts blow for blow. Here's the trivia that actually explains why Roman feels a little different from every killer around him. Scream 3 is the only one of the first 4 films Kevin Williamson didn't fully write. He was buried under other commitments and could only turn in a rough outline, so the studio brought in a different writer to finish the job under a tight deadline. Some of Williamson's abandoned ideas for that film, a serial killer with an actual fan club, later resurfaced years afterward in one of his television shows, and pieces of that concept also seeped into Jill Roberts' motivation in Scream 4, which we're about to get to. Roman is a fascinating, ambitious killer trapped inside a production that was falling apart around him, and you can feel both things at once every time he's on screen. Jill Roberts, played by Emma Roberts, might be the most quietly ahead of its time villain concept this franchise has ever produced. Her entire plan is built around manufacturing her own survival story, killing her friends, framing her boyfriend, and positioning herself as the new final girl for a media landscape that rewards trauma with attention. Remember, this movie came out in 2011, years before anyone was casually using the word influencer in everyday conversation. Watch it today, and her motivation reads less like satire and more like prophecy. Her body count is actually low compared to a lot of names on this list. She only personally kills a couple of people herself, but her ambition is enormous, and she comes closer than almost anyone to actually pulling the whole scheme off. That's not just a feeling either. Kevin Williamson has confirmed in interviews that his original draft ended on a cliffhanger with Jill still alive and Sydney's fate left deliberately unclear, setting up a planned sequel where Jill would resurface at college as a killer being hunted by a brand new Ghostface, essentially becoming this franchise's first repeat villain. Test audiences and studio notes push the ending towards something more conclusive, so the version we actually got has Sydney shooting Jill dead in that hospital room instead. It's a fascinating what-if, a version of this franchise where the final girl formula gets broken entirely because the villain survives to fight another day. There's one more small piece of trivia worth mentioning here too. Reports around Scream 7's production revealed that both Jill and Mickey were originally scripted for brief cameo appearances in the newest film, tying the franchise's 30-year history together on screen, but scheduling conflict between the two actors made it impossible to shoot. It's a shame, because both of these killers represent exactly the kind of ambition this franchise does best. Someone smart enough to almost get away with it, undone by their own desperate need to be seen. Richie Kirsch, played by Jack Quaid, spends most of his movie being the single least threatening person in the room, a slightly nerdy, extremely supportive boyfriend who exists mostly to be nice to Sam and get along with her friends. That's exactly the point. When the mask finally comes off, the whiplash is real, and Quaid pulls off a genuinely difficult acting trick, playing the exact same guy before and after the reveal, while somehow making both versions completely believable. His motive is where this franchise gets its most self-aware in years. Richie is a fan who convinced himself the last few installments of the fictional Stab franchise inside this universe had gotten it all wrong, and that the only way to fix it was to engineer a brand new, more brutal killing spree that studios would be forced to adapt. He's not killing out of revenge or fame. He's killing out of a genuine, twisted belief that he's improving the source material. That's a specific, modern kind of dangerous. The person who loves something so much they think they're entitled to destroy and rebuild it in their own image. He grooms Amber into carrying out most of the actual killing while he handles the bigger picture, which makes him more architect than executioner, but don't mistake that for cowardice. He's plenty willing to get his hands dirty himself once things go sideways, and his death, at the hands of Sam, the daughter of the original killer he idolizes, is one of the more satisfying full-circle moments this franchise has ever pulled off. What really elevates Richie is the way the writing plays fair with the audience the entire time. Every clue is technically there before the reveal, his oddly specific knowledge of the fictional Stab movies, his insistence on being close to the investigation, and yet the performance is warm enough that most first-time viewers still get completely blindsided. That's the mark of a script and a performance working in perfect sync, which is rarer in this franchise's more recent era than fans like to admit. Richie proves that this series still knows exactly how to build a Ghostface from the ground up when it wants to. Nancy Loomis, better known through most of Scream 2 as Debbie Salt, a reporter who's been hiding in plain sight the entire runtime, might be the single best disguised killer in this entire franchise. She's on screen constantly. She's mildly annoying in exactly the way a background character should be, and not one person in the movie, or in the audience, seriously considers her a suspect until the exact moment the movie wants you to. That is genuinely difficult to pull off in a franchise where audiences show up actively trying to guess the killer before the credits roll. Laurie Metcalf plays her like she's performing Greek tragedy in a slasher movie, and honestly, that's not far off for what the character actually is, a mother consumed entirely by grief and vengeance for a son who died committing mass murder. Her motive is deeply personal in a way a lot of the killers on this list can't claim. She genuinely believes Sydney destroyed her family, and every choice she makes flows directly from that belief. There's also a nasty bit of collateral damage baked into her backstory. An innocent man spent time behind bars for a murder her own son actually committed back in the original film, and she never shows the slightest concern about that wreckage on her way to getting her revenge. She recruits Mickey, manipulates him completely, and has every intention of pinning the entire spree on him the second the smoke clears. That's the same script leak-driven plan we talked about back in Part 2, and it's a much scarier idea than the version fans almost got instead. A mother willing to weaponize a stranger's obsession with fame just to get close enough to finish what she started. Cold, patient, and terrifyingly convincing, and unlike almost everyone else on this list, she nearly walks away clean, right up until the very last scene. Here's one more piece of trivia worth knowing before we hit the final two names, because it applies to every single killer on this entire list equally. That mask itself wasn't originally designed for this franchise at all. It started life as a mass-produced novelty Halloween mask from a company called Fun World, loosely inspired by Edvard Munch's famous Painting the Scream, and the production team stumbled across it hanging on a wall while scouting filming locations. Wes Craven loved it on sight and fought to get the rights to use it. Once the film came out, that same mass-produced mask became the best-selling Halloween costume in the entire United States, a title it still holds today. Every killer on this countdown, from Gregg Bruckner all the way up to the name we're about to land on, wore a costume that used to just sit on a shelf in a party store. That's a genuinely strange piece of pop culture history. Stu Macker, played by Matthew Lillard, might be the most purely entertaining killer this franchise has ever produced, and 30 years later, he's still the character everyone quotes first. What's remarkable about Stu is that a huge amount of what makes him so memorable wasn't even fully scripted. Lillard reportedly improvised a large portion of his most iconic lines and physical choices on set, and it shows. There's an unhinged, almost feral energy to his performance that feels less like acting and more like the actor genuinely enjoying himself in the worst possible way. Stu's motive is deceptively simple. He's not avenging anyone, he's not chasing fame. He's doing it because Billy asked him to and because, on some level, he just wanted to know what it would feel like. That's a disturbing kind of honesty most killers on this list don't have the guts to admit to. He's also, alongside Billy, one of only 2 killers in the entire franchise who genuinely seem to have done their homework on horror movies as a craft rather than just referencing them as trivia, which makes their partnership the most creatively dangerous pairing this franchise has ever assembled. Stu also gets one of the most purely chaotic death scenes in the entire franchise, electrocuted and crushed by a falling television during the climax. And even in his final moments, the performance never dips into anything less than fully committed. Nearly every subordinate Ghostface who came after him, Charlie, Amber, Jason, all of them, feels like the franchise trying to recapture a little bit of that same unhinged energy once the mask comes off, and none of them have quite managed it. Stu set the template for what a secondary killer could be, and 30 years of imitators haven't dethroned him yet. Here's the detail that makes Stu's legacy even wilder. Scream 7 brought Matthew Lillard back after nearly 30 years, using deepfake technology within the story itself to fake video calls from a resurrected version of Stu, tormenting Sydney throughout the film. The characters even mock the idea out loud, more or less saying it would be a ridiculous, cheap twist if Stu were somehow still alive. Right before the movie does something conceptually right next door to exactly that, using artificial intelligence instead of a literal resurrection. And in an even stranger twist, it turns out Kevin Williamson genuinely shot an alternate ending for Scream 7 that outright revealed Stu was still alive before test audiences rejected it, and it got cut for the final release. almost 30 years after getting his head shoved into a television set. This character is still the one the franchise can't fully let go of. That's not a small thing. That's a legacy. There was only ever going to be one name at the top of this list. Billy Loomis, played by Skeet Ulrich, is the original template. The killer every single other name on this ranking is, in some way, a variation of. He's cunning enough to fake his own death mid-movie, patient enough to spend an entire film playing the supportive, slightly suspicious boyfriend without ever fully tipping his hand, and vicious enough to kill Sydney's own mother as the actual root motive behind the entire spree. Every trick this franchise has used 17 times over, the red herring, the two-killer structure, the personal, deeply intimate motive, starts here, with him. What makes Billy genuinely dangerous, as opposed to just memorable, is how personal his manipulation gets. He doesn't just attack Sydney physically. He takes her trust, her first relationship, and her sense of safety, and weaponizes all three at once. Finding out your first boyfriend is also your mother's killer is about as devastating a betrayal as this genre has ever written, and the film earns every second of that gut punch because it spends its entire runtime making you like him first. Wes Craven said it best on that commentary track we mentioned back in part 1. The scariest killers are the smart ones, and Billy is the smartest, most controlled performance this franchise has ever produced. The reveal itself is a genuine structural achievement, too. The two-killer twist wasn't just a gimmick. It fundamentally changed what audiences expected from a whodunit going forward. The film spends real energy making both Billy and Stu individually plausible red herrings and individually plausible innocent bystanders at different points, so that even attentive viewers walk away second-guessing themselves. That trick has been copied by countless slashers since, and none of them have managed to make the reveal feel as devastating on a purely emotional level as it does here, because none of them bothered building an entire romantic relationship as the delivery mechanism for the twist. His influence didn't even end when he died. Decades later, this franchise revealed that Sam Carpenter, the lead of the newest era of films, is Billy's biological daughter, meaning his choices are still directly shaping the plot of movies released a full generation after his death. Oh, you can draw a direct line from Billy's original plan all the way through Richie's toxic fandom plot, through Wayne Bailey's revenge for his son, all the way to Jessica Bowden hiding next door to Sydney in the newest film. Every single killer we've covered across all three parts of this video is, in some way, still answering the question Billy asked back in 1996, what happens when the person you trust most turns out to be the thing you should have feared? The character got parroted endlessly, referenced constantly, and copied by nearly every meta-slasher that came after, and none of the imitators have managed to make a mask this scary while also making the person under it this tragic. 30 years, 7 films, well over $1 billion in worldwide box office, and this franchise has never found a killer who tops the very first one. That's not nostalgia talking. That's just the math. Before we wrap up completely, a quick honorable mention for 2 killers we didn't fold into this main ranking, Beth and Jamal Elliott, better known as Jay, from the television continuation of this franchise. Beth spends an entire season quietly orchestrating a 5-victim spree with a level of patience the movies rarely have time for. Using the extra hours of television format gives her to manipulate an entire ensemble cast one relationship at a time, something a 2-hour film almost never has room to do properly. Jay is the opposite approach, entirely pure, impulsive violence with almost no interest in strategy at all, the kind of killer who doesn't need much convincing before he acts. They didn't make the numbered list because this ranking is built around the 7 theatrical films that most casual fans actually saw in a movie theater. But if you're only watching the movies and skipping the show, you're missing a genuinely underrated stretch of this franchise, one that got us slowed down and build dread over 10 episodes instead of 90 minutes. If enough of you want it, I'll happily put together a separate ranking that folds the television killers improperly. Let me know down in the comments. So here's the full order, top to bottom, one more time. Billy Loomis, Stu Macker, Mrs. Loomis, Richie Kirsch, Jill Roberts, Roman Bridger, Mickey Alteri, Amber Freeman, Charlie Walker, Detective Wayne Bailey, Quinn Bailey, Ethan Landry, Jessica Bowden, Marco Davis, Karl Gibbs, Jason Carver, and dead last, Gregg Bruckner. 30 years, 17 killers, and one mask that keeps finding new people willing to put on. What's wild is that Scream 7 just proved this franchise still has box office life left in it no matter what critics think of the writing. Pushing this series past $1 billion in total worldwide earnings and putting in the same company as horror giants like The Conjuring and Alien. That kind of number means there's a real chance we're doing this again in a few years with an 18th name added to the list. Personally, I hope whoever writes the next one takes a hard look at what made Billy and Stu work in the first place. A motive that's actually personal, a reveal that's actually earned, rather than just another twist for the sake of having one. If you want to guess who that 18th killer might end up being, or if you think I've buried somebody way too low on this ranking, the comment section is right there waiting for you. Let me know your own personal top 3. Tell me which reveal actually got you the first time you watched it. And be honest, tell me if you had Billy figured out before the credits rolled, or if he got you too. If you enjoyed this breakdown, there's a lot more horror franchise content waiting for you on this channel. And if you're new here, this is exactly the kind of deep dive we do on a regular basis. So sticking around is probably worth your while. Thanks for making it through all 3 parts of this one with me. I will see you in the next video.